The announcement that shook the stars. The cold emptiness of space stretched out infinitely in every direction. Stars twinkled like distant jewels, each one a beacon of mystery and wonder. But despite the vastness of the galaxy, there was a tension in the air, something new and unsettling that everyone could feel. Something was about to change. Across the galaxy, the greatest civilizations that ruled the stars were already on edge. For centuries, the Excelcorians, the Rillians, and the Terrans had fought, negotiated, and survived in the delicate balance of power. It wasn't just about control of planets anymore. It was about the future of the universe itself. Each faction had its own ambitions, its own way of seeing the stars. But no one could have predicted what was coming. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an encrypted message, broadcast across every known communication channel. It was simple, yet its words struck like lightning. The Empire is coming. At first, there was disbelief. The words seemed like a joke, maybe a threat from some rogue faction or a prank from a rebellious planet. But as the message repeated over and over across the galaxy's many systems, it became clear that this was something different, something more serious. The Terran Federation was the first to react. It wasn't that they feared the words themselves. After all, they had faced threats from every corner of space. But the Empire, whoever they were, seemed to know something the Terrans didn't, and that terrified them. In the heart of the Terran capital, Earth, Admiral Sarah Hunter gathered her most trusted officers. The room was filled with tense whispers as they discussed the possible origins of the message. Could it be a new enemy, or was it just a well-coordinated hoax? Either way, they couldn't afford to take it lightly. "I don't like this," said Admiral Hunter, her voice firm but full of doubt. "We've dealt with pirates, rebel groups, and alien invaders. But this is different. We know nothing about the Empire. They've never been mentioned in any of our records." General Terrell, a grizzled veteran of the Federation's many wars, nodded grimly. "And that's what worries me. There's something more here, something we don't understand. If they can strike fear into the heart of the Federation this easily, they must be powerful." The Empire's message wasn't limited to the Terrans. The Excelcorians, known for their incredible technological prowess, intercepted it next. Their capital ship, a massive floating city, hummed with activity as the Council of the Excelcor began to gather. "The Empire, are we certain it's not a Terran trick?" Councillor Yelra asked, though her voice was shaky. The Excelcorians were never ones to show fear, but even they couldn't ignore the threat in the message. "The Terrans wouldn't dare send a message this bold," replied Lord Joran, the head of the Excelcor military. "This has the markings of something far more serious. We need to prepare for the worst." Meanwhile, far across the galaxy, the Rillians, a race known for their psychic abilities and peaceful nature, were just as shaken. The Rillians had never been warlike. They preferred diplomacy and maintaining harmony between civilizations. But even they knew that peace could not last forever, especially when an unknown enemy appeared on the horizon. In the quiet halls of their central citadel, Ambassador Nyra Keth pondered the message, her fingers pressed lightly against her temple as she reached out with her mind, trying to sense the truth behind the words. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't sense anything. There was no trace of the Empire's presence in the psychic currents that flowed through the galaxy. It was as though they didn't exist, until now. As the days passed, rumors began to swirl. Ships had been disappearing from various sectors without a trace. Entire fleets, once thought invincible, had been scattered without so much as a warning. But the strangest part, there were no signs of battle, no wreckage, no distress signals, just silence. And in that silence, the galaxy began to tremble with uncertainty. Was the Empire already here? Were they watching, waiting for the right moment to strike? Or were they something more, a force so powerful that the very fabric of space itself trembled in fear at their approach? The galaxy held its breath, waiting for the next announcement, the next sign of what was to come. The mystery of the Empire loomed large over every system, and there was only one thing everyone knew for certain now. Things would never be the same again. In every corner of the galaxy, leaders, generals, and citizens alike were filled with questions. What would happen if the Empire did come? Could anyone stand against such a powerful force, whatever it might be? Or was the galaxy doomed to fall under their shadow? The Empire was coming, and no one knew how to stop it. The first strike. The galaxy was a powder keg, and every leader, every citizen, could feel the pressure building. The mysterious Empire, whose name alone sent ripples of fear through the stars, had left the galaxy in a state of constant anxiety. The first announcement had been simple, cryptic, but now, the moment of truth was fast approaching. The Terrans were the first to act, gathering their fleets in strategic positions, ready for anything. Admiral Sarah Hunter stood on the bridge of the U.S. Valkyrie, her sharp eyes scanning the vastness of space. Her crew moved like a well-oiled machine, preparing for a war they had no idea was coming. The unknown nature of the Empire made it impossible to predict their next move. Would they strike with overwhelming force, or would they attempt to infiltrate and weaken them from the inside? "We need answers," Admiral Hunter said, her voice steady, though the weight of uncertainty hung over her like a storm cloud. "Find out everything you can. Who are they? Where are they? I want their weakness, and I want it now." As her officers worked feverishly, the tension among the crew grew palpable. Every report that came in was filled with more questions than answers. No one knew anything about the Empire. No records, no intelligence, just whispers and fear. The U.S. Valkyrie was not the only ship in the Terran fleet. Thousands of other ships, from dreadnoughts to cruisers, were scattered across the galaxy, all waiting for the signal to act. But there was still nothing. Then, just as the frustration reached its peak, a new transmission arrived. It was another broadcast, but this time, the message was different, clearer, more deliberate. "We are the Empire. We are the end of your world. Surrender or face destruction." It wasn't just a message, it was a declaration of war. The entire Terran fleet braced itself for the inevitable, their weapons primed and ready. They didn't know who they were fighting, but the galaxy had never seen an enemy like this. The Empire's boldness left no room for hesitation. And then, without warning, it happened. The first strike came from the edge of the solar system, where the Federation had established a defense perimeter. At first, there was only a flicker in the distant reaches of space, a sudden shift in the fabric of the void. Then the galaxy watched in horror as a massive ship, unlike anything the Terrans had ever seen, appeared from the darkness. It was a behemoth, its dark hull almost blending into the shadows of space. It radiated power and menace. Its shape was impossible to describe, a fusion of organic curves and sharp angular lines, like something born from both metal and living tissue. The ship was massive, far larger than any dreadnought the Terrans had ever built. It exuded an aura of absolute authority. Before the Terrans could even react, the Empire's ship unleashed a devastating wave of energy. The shockwave rippled through space, and the U.S. Valkyrie felt the tremor all the way from the edge of their fleet. The Terrans fired back, launching every missile, every laser cannon at the massive ship, but it was as if their weapons were nothing more than sparks against an impenetrable wall. The ship's energy shield absorbed every attack effortlessly, and in retaliation, it fired another blast, this time directed at the heart of the Terran defense fleet. The first fleet was shattered in an instant. Ships were torn apart by the devastating energy blasts, their once proud hulls disintegrating into clouds of debris. The Terrans tried to regroup, but it was clear that the Empire's firepower was beyond anything they had ever encountered. It was as if they had unlocked a secret of warfare no one else had. From the debris of the fleet, the Valkyrie was one of the few ships that managed to escape the blast. But even it was damaged, its engines sputtering, its hull scarred from the destructive energy. "We need to retreat now," Commander Harris shouted, urgency in his voice. "We're outmatched." Admiral Hunter's face was grim as she surveyed the destruction. There was no denying it now. The Empire was real, and they were far more powerful than anything the Terrans had prepared for. But retreating wasn't an option. Not for her. Not for her crew. Not for the Federation. "We'll fight back," Hunter said, her voice cold and determined. "Get us back in the fight. Contact the other fleets. We have to warn the rest of the galaxy." But as the U.S. Valkyrie limped back to a safer location, the reality of their situation hit hard. The Empire had struck their first blow, and it had been devastating. Across the galaxy, the Excelocorians and the Rillians were preparing for their own defenses. They had seen the destruction, heard the message. The Empire's arrival had been undeniable. And yet, despite the fear, despite the destruction, one question remained on everyone's mind. Who was the Empire? What did they want with the galaxy? And most importantly, could anyone stop them? The first battle had been lost, but the war was just beginning. The galaxy was on the brink of a conflict unlike any it had ever seen, and no one knew where it would lead. The Silent War. The battle had ended, but the war had only just begun. The galaxy, once filled with the hum of peace and the quiet flow of diplomacy, now stood on the brink of chaos. The Terran Federation, once a symbol of strength and resilience, had just tasted defeat. The Empire, with its terrifying display of power, had proven that it was not a mere threat. It was a force that could shatter everything the galaxy had built. The Terrans weren't the only ones who felt the weight of this new reality. The Excelocorians, known for their advanced technology and formidable military, had also experienced the devastation. Their vast fleets, which had once dominated the stars, now lay in ruins, scattered across the galaxy. Yet, despite their losses, the Excelocorians did not retreat into fear. Instead, they gathered their strength and turned their eyes toward the Empire. Counselor Yelra, one of the most respected members of the Excelocor High Council, stood before a vast holographic display, her eyes narrowed as she analyzed the reports. The Excelocorians were not accustomed to losing, and the sudden, brutal attack had shaken them to their core. But as they picked up the pieces of their shattered fleets, they began to realize something that no one else had seen before. "There's something strange about the Empire's technology," Yelra murmured. "It's not just their weapons or ships. It's how they move through space. They seem to appear from nowhere. It's like they can manipulate the very fabric of the universe." Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Lord Joran, the military leader of the Excelocor forces. His face was grim, his eyes clouded with concern. "The Empire's ships are unlike anything we've ever encountered," he said. "But it's not just their technology. I fear they're more than just a military force. I believe they have something more." Yelra looked at him, her expression intense. "You mean they may have some kind of power beyond technology?" Joran nodded, his gaze darkening. "Yes, it's almost as if their very presence warps reality. We've never seen anything like it. Our most advanced scanners can't even get an accurate reading of their ships. They seem to exist in a way that defies our understanding of space itself." The Excelocor High Council was beginning to grasp the enormity of the situation. They had always prided themselves on their scientific discoveries, their mastery over the laws of nature. But now, they were facing an enemy whose very existence bent those laws. The more they tried to understand the Empire, the less they truly knew. Meanwhile, far from the Excelocor's hidden citadels and Terran command centers, the Rillians were facing their own growing fears. They had always been a peaceful people, relying on their psychic abilities and diplomatic skills to maintain order in the galaxy. But with the Empire's overwhelming power on display, even the most hopeful of the Rillians were starting to question whether diplomacy could stop such a force. Ambassador Nyraketh had spent her life fostering peace across the galaxy. Now she stood before the Rillians' Grand Assembly, a gathering of the most powerful psychic minds in her species. Despite her calm demeanor, the weight of the Empire's threat was evident in her posture. "We are not warriors," Nyra said, her voice soft but steady. But the Empire has made it clear that their goal is not peace. They do not seek understanding. They seek submission. Her words echoed through the council chamber, and the faces around her shifted from the serenity of diplomats to the solemnity of those who had finally recognized the truth. The Rillians had to act, swiftly and decisively, but what could they do against an enemy that bent reality to its will? One of the youngest council members, a gifted psychic named Lyra, spoke up. What if we could use our abilities against them? What if we could reach into their minds, find the source of their power? Naira hesitated. She knew that the Rillians' psychic abilities were vast, but she also knew the limits of their powers. The Empire was too foreign, too enigmatic to be understood by any force they had ever encountered. "It's a dangerous idea," Naira replied, "but we may have no other choice. We must understand their tactics, their weaknesses, and we must find a way to connect with other civilizations that are willing to fight." As the Rillians began to prepare their own response to the Empire, the galaxy as a whole found itself at a crossroads. The question was no longer whether the Empire would strike again. It was when and where. The events of the past weeks had proven that the Empire wasn't content with simply sending a warning. They had come to conquer, to change the galaxy in their image. The first major strike from the Empire had shattered the confidence of the galaxy's major factions. The Terrans had lost many of their best fleets. The Excelocorians were struggling to adapt to an enemy that seemed beyond comprehension. And the Rillians, though they had yet to engage, knew that their peaceful ways were no match for a force that sought total domination. And yet, in the hearts of those who had been affected by the Empire's invasion, something stirred. A defiance, a determination to survive, to fight back. The galaxy was waking up to the reality of a war unlike any it had known. But despite the fear, despite the overwhelming odds, there was a spark of resistance. It was small, it was fragile, but it was there. On the fringes of the galaxy, scattered in the shadow of the unknown, rogue factions and freedom fighters began to form. They had seen the same things the major powers had seen: the destruction, the terror, the silence that followed each of the Empire's strikes. But they also knew one truth: the galaxy would not surrender. The first battles had been lost, but this war was far from over. The question remained: could the galaxy unite against the Empire, or would it fall to its knee before the unknown force that had brought it to its breaking point? The spark of resistance. The galaxy was fractured, the threads of unity that once held it together now torn apart by the arrival of the Empire. The Terrans, the Excelocorians, the Rillians, and many others had suffered their first major defeat. But amid the chaos and despair, something began to stir, a flicker of resistance, a realization that the galaxy's fight for survival had only just begun. It began with whispers. Among the wreckage of the Terran fleets, a few survivors clung to hope. They gathered in secret, far from the prying eyes of the Empire, speaking of rebellion, of a fight that could turn the tide. The idea was simple: if they couldn't defeat the Empire in a direct confrontation, they would have to outthink them. They would have to attack where the Empire was weakest: its arrogance, its assumption that no one could challenge them. Admiral Sarah Hunter was one of the key figures in this growing resistance. Though she had witnessed the destruction of her fleet, the loss of so many lives, she had not given up. The U.S. Valkyrie had been heavily damaged, but it had survived, and it had become a symbol of the Terran refusal to bow to the Empire. Now, it was time to rally the scattered remnants of their forces. She stood before a small group of officers in a hidden command center, deep in the asteroid belt on the fringes of the Federation's former territory. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of holographic displays and the occasional flicker of lights from old battle-worn consoles. The air was thick with tension, but Hunter's voice cut through it like a blade. "We're not alone in this," she said, her eyes burning with determination. "The Empire may have crushed our fleets, but we've seen their weakness. They rely too much on their power, on the fear they create. We will not let them control us." One of her officers, Commander Harris, stepped forward. But how do we fight them? We don't have the fleets, the resources, or the technology to face them head-on. Hunter nodded solemnly. We don't need to face them directly. We need to hit them where it hurts. We'll create chaos, disrupt their communications, sabotage their supply lines. We'll use the tactics they never saw coming. It wasn't much, but it was enough to ignite the first flame of resistance. As Hunter and her officers began to plan their next moves, the Terrans weren't the only ones waking up to the reality of the Empire's threat. The Excellicorians, too, began to organize. The loss of their fleets had been devastating, but the Council understood that they couldn't afford to back down. The Empire's power was undeniable, but it was still possible to push back, and this time they would be ready. Lord Joran, the Excellicor military leader, had spent days combing through their wreckage, analyzing the Empire's tactics. The more he learned, the more he realized that their opponent was not simply stronger, but different, fighting with a strategy that went beyond mere firepower. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Empire was playing a game on a level that Excellicorians had never encountered before. We cannot fight them the way we fought the Terrans or the Rillians, Joran said in a tense meeting with Counselor Yelra. Their power is overwhelming, but there's something off about their methods. Their ships don't follow predictable patterns. Their strategies seem to be evolving. Yelra, her face a mask of concentration, looked at the holographic maps of the galaxy, tracing the paths the Empire had taken. They're not just advancing. They're learning. Every move they make is one step ahead of us. The more we resist, the more they adapt. And if we can't stop them? Joran asked. Yelra's eyes narrowed. Then we will have to change the rules. We need to find out where their power comes from. We need to understand them, not just as an enemy, but as something alien. The Excellicorians, though shaken, were already planning a new strategy. They had no intention of going down without a fight. Their research into the Empire's strange technology and the unexplainable power behind their attacks would be their key to resistance. Meanwhile, the Rillians, though hesitant to engage in direct warfare, began to reach out to other civilizations. The psychic link that connected their people was strong, and Nyra Keth, the Rillians' ambassador, knew that this was a time for unity. In the quiet chambers of the Grand Assembly, she spoke to her people of the need for allies, of the need to stand together against the Empire's ever-growing threat. We may not fight with weapons, but we can still be a force to be reckoned with, Nyra said. Our minds are stronger than we realize. If we can't break their fleets, perhaps we can break their resolve. We can infiltrate their minds, sow doubt, disrupt their leaders. It was a risky plan, but it was one they had to try. Across the galaxy, small pockets of resistance began to form. Fractured at first, they were nothing compared to the might of the Empire. But the Empire had underestimated one thing: the spirit of the galaxy's inhabitants. Despite the overwhelming odds, despite the terror the Empire spread with each new strike, something deep within the heart of the galaxy was awakening. And that awakening would become the spark that could light the fire of rebellion. The Empire had made its move. Now, the galaxy would make its stand. The rising tide. The Empire's grip on the galaxy tightened with each passing day, their massive warships blotting out the stars. The once divided factions now faced the harsh reality. Their survival depended on coming together, on setting aside old grudges and uniting against a common enemy. The Terrans, the Excellicorians, the Rillians, and many other smaller resistance groups slowly began to rally under one banner: the banner of survival. Admiral Sarah Hunter had become a symbol of hope for the Terrans. The once destroyed U.S. Valkyrie had become the heart of their resistance. The fleet, now pieced together with whatever ships the Terran fleet could salvage, had grown into a force to be reckoned with. It was no longer just about fighting back. It was about making a statement to the Empire. The galaxy would not bend. Hunter stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie, her face grim as she looked out into the vast expanse of space. The crew worked tirelessly, coordinating efforts with allies across the galaxy. There was a buzz of activity in every corner of the ship as new intelligence reports came in from Selachor spies, Rillian psychic scouts, and even smaller groups of freedom fighters who had pledged their loyalty to the cause. The Empire had made the mistake of thinking they could crush the galaxy's resolve with one strike. They were wrong. "We've lost battles," Admiral Hunter said, addressing her officers. "But every defeat brings us closer to victory. Every loss strengthens our resolve. We know their tactics now. We know how they move. They may be powerful, but they're not invincible." Commander Harris nodded, watching the stars through the viewports. "Their arrogance blinds them, Admiral. They're assuming we'll scatter, that we'll break. But we're not breaking. We're regrouping. We're learning. And soon, we'll hit them where it hurts." The Terrans weren't alone in this. The Excelocorians, having spent countless hours studying the Empire's ships and technology, had begun to develop new strategies and weapons. Lord Joran had personally led the charge to harness their best minds and engineers, focused on adapting their technology to counter the Empire's superior firepower. They knew they had to outsmart their enemy if they were to stand a chance. "We cannot match their numbers, their sheer strength," Joran admitted during a strategy meeting with Counselor Yulra. "But we can use their overconfidence against them. Our best engineers believe they found a way to disrupt their energy fields, disrupt their shields. It's risky, but it's our best shot." Yulra raised an eyebrow. "If we fail, across the galaxy, the Rillians were not idle either. Their psychic abilities, though not as suited to open warfare as the Terran or Excelcor fleets, were invaluable in other ways." Ambassador Nyraketh, once only a diplomat, had become a strategist and leader for the United Forces. The Rillians' ability to probe the minds of others gave them insight into the Empire's leaders and plans. Though the Rillians couldn't control the minds of the Empire's forces, they could weaken their resolve, plant seeds of doubt, and feed confusion into their command structure. "We can break them mentally if we can get close enough," Naira had said in her message to the United Forces. "If we work together, the Empire's fear tactics will no longer work. We must disrupt their unity, fracture them from the inside." As the resistance groups shared intelligence and resources, small victories began to emerge. A covert Terran operation successfully sabotaged an Empire supply depot on a remote moon. A small fleet of Selachor ships destroyed one of the Empire's supply lines, cutting off vital resources to their war machine. And the Rillians, using their psychic skills, intercepted key communications from the Empire, feeding misinformation that caused confusion among the Empire's leaders. It was a new kind of war, one fought in the shadows, in the minds of the enemy, and in the hearts of the people. The Empire's reliance on sheer force had made them blind to the power of unity, the strength of a people who refused to bow to fear. But the Empire was not blind to the growing resistance. They knew the galaxy's factions were uniting, and they were growing wary. They had underestimated the tenacity of the smaller species, and they had underestimated the resolve of the Terrans. Their arrogance was about to cost them. On a cold, barren planet in the Outer Rim, the Resistance was preparing for its largest strike yet. A coalition of Terran, Selachor, and Rillians had gathered for a final push to strike at the heart of the Empire's military operations. They had learned all they could from the Empire's movements and technology, and now they would make their move. Their plan was bold, risky, but it was their best chance for victory. "We will make this the beginning of the end," Admiral Hunter said, standing before the United Forces. "We will hit them hard, and we will hit them fast. We have nothing to lose, and they have everything to lose. This is our galaxy. We will take it back." As the fleet of ships, once fractured and scattered, now moved in unison toward the Empire's core systems, something unspoken and powerful united them. The people of the galaxy had lost much, but they were not broken. The spark of rebellion had grown into a fire that no one could put out. The Resistance was ready, and they would make the Empire pay for every life lost. for every world destroyed. The Empire's dominance had been unchallenged for far too long. But now, the galaxy was no longer afraid. The tides were shifting, and a storm was coming that the Empire could never have anticipated. The first steps toward victory had been taken. The battle for the galaxy was far from over, but now, the forces of resistance were ready to turn the tide in their favor. The battle for the future. The stars above the barren planet flickered like distant witnesses to what was about to unfold. The united forces of the Terrans, the Excelcorians, and the Rillians stood ready for the largest assault the galaxy had ever seen. Their fleets had gathered in secrecy, moving swiftly through the void, prepared to strike at the heart of the Empire's military infrastructure. This was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for freedom, for the future of every species that called the galaxy home. Admiral Sarah Hunter stood at the command console of the U.S. Valkyrie, her hand steady as she scanned the incoming reports. Her face was hardened by the battles they had faced, but there was a fire in her eyes that was unmistakable. This time, they would be the ones to strike the first blow. "We've waited for this moment too long," Hunter said, her voice low but resolute. "The Empire's arrogance has blinded them. They think they control everything, but they've underestimated us. They've underestimated the will of this galaxy." Commander Harris, standing beside her, nodded. "This is it. If we succeed, we hit them where it hurts the most. We disrupt their power centers, their command structures. Their military is a house of cards. Admiral, one push and it all falls down." Across the vast expanse of space, the Allied fleet was ready. Terran ships, now reinforced with remnants of the Federation's once proud navy, moved into position. The Excelcorians had provided their most advanced technology, adapting their ships to counter the Empire's energy shields and weapons. And the Rillians, using their psychic abilities, had coordinated the timing of the assault, ensuring that their enemies were kept off balance and confused. Every faction had contributed their unique strengths to this mission. The first phase of the operation was critical. A coordinated strike to disable the Empire's communication hubs and key supply lines. It would be the opening move of many, but it had to be precise. If successful, it would buy them the time they needed to launch a larger offensive. Admiral Hunter's voice cut through the tense silence of the command room. "Launch the first wave. No second chances." As the order was given, the sky above the planet erupted in flashes of light. The first wave of ships, carrying the bravest warriors from all corners of the galaxy, sped forward into the heart of the Empire's territory. Terran fighters, Celicor warships, and Rillian's psychic scouts moved together in a synchronized formation, a unified force made stronger by their shared purpose. As the fleet entered the Empire's heavily fortified zone, the first signs of battle were brutal. Empire warships, massive and intimidating, appeared from the shadows. Their weapons fired without hesitation, sending deadly bursts of energy into the advancing ships. But the resistance had anticipated this. The Celicor ships, with their newly adapted tech, absorbed the incoming fire with ease, their energy shields holding firm. The Empire had yet to realize that their usual overwhelming power was no longer enough. The first clash between the fleets was devastating. Explosions ripped through space as ships from both sides collided in a fiery chaos of energy blasts and missile strikes. The Terran fleet led the charge, their ships darting through the firestorm as they launched precision strikes against the Empire's communication hubs and supply lines. Meanwhile, the Rillians, using their psychic abilities, created an invisible network of confusion, planting false commands in the minds of the Empire's commanders, causing their ships to hesitate, their actions to become erratic. "Direct hit on the supply depot," Harris reported, his voice tense with excitement. "We've got them off balance." But just as the momentum seemed to shift in their favor, the Empire unleashed their next wave. A vast, seemingly endless armada that appeared out of nowhere, its sheer size staggering. The resistance forces, though prepared, now found themselves fighting an uphill battle. They've brought in reinforcements. Joran, the Celicor military leader, reported over the comms. We can't afford to be overwhelmed. The fleet is too large. We need a new plan. Admiral Hunter's eyes narrowed. The Empire's fleet was massive, but they were relying too heavily on their brute force. Hunter knew they had one chance left to turn the tide, one final strike to destabilize the Empire's command structure. She turned to her officers, her voice unwavering. This is it. We hit their flagship, disrupt their command, and their fleet falls apart. But the flagship of the Empire was not easily reached. It was protected by layers of defense, surrounded by hundreds of smaller ships and an impenetrable energy field. It was a fortress in space, a symbol of the Empire's dominance. Taking it down would require everything they had. The Allied fleet pushed forward, fighting tooth and nail, but it was clear that the battle was reaching its tipping point. The Empire's ships were starting to gain the upper hand, their firepower overwhelming the smaller, more vulnerable ships of the Resistance. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a breakthrough came. The Rillians, who had been working tirelessly in the background, managed to create a psychic breach in the Empire's communications, allowing the Allied forces to sneak past the Empire's defenses. It was a risky move, but it worked. The Terran fighters, led by Admiral Hunter herself, made their final dash toward the Empire's flagship. As they neared the flagship, Hunter's heart raced. This was it, the moment that would determine the fate of the galaxy. The Empire's flagship loomed large in front of her, its dark hull and massive weapon systems now vulnerable, exposed. With a final, desperate push, the Valkyrie and the remaining fighters launched their final assault. The flagship's shields faltered under the combined barrage of fire from the Allied fleet, and as the Terran fighters closed in, a precise strike from the Celicor warships disabled the flagship's power core. The Empire's greatest symbol of dominance was finally brought to its knees. The battle wasn't over, but the tides had shifted. The Empire's command structure was in disarray, and their forces were beginning to retreat. For the first time in years, the galaxy saw the possibility of victory. "We've done it," Hunter whispered, staring out at the wreckage of the Empire's flagship. The Resistance had won the first major battle of the war. The Empire's hold on the galaxy was weakening, and hope had been restored. But this was only the beginning. The war was far from over, and the road ahead would be long and difficult. Yet, for the first time, the galaxy knew they could win. The spark of resistance had become a raging fire, and the Empire would learn to fear the united will of the galaxy's people. The Empire's last stand. The victory at the Empire's flagship had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the first time, the once unstoppable force of the Empire had been crippled. The alliance of Terrans, Celcorians, Rillians, and smaller resistance groups had proven that their unity, their will to fight, could overcome the might of an overwhelming enemy. The message was clear. The Empire's reign was fragile, and the galaxy was no longer afraid. But the victory was bittersweet. The battle had cost them dearly. The Allied fleets had suffered tremendous losses, and the debris of fallen ships, once proud symbols of resistance, now floated in the void. Many heroes had fallen, their sacrifices etched into the fabric of the war. Yet their deaths were not in vain. The tide had turned, and the Empire, though staggering, was not yet defeated. Admiral Sarah Hunter stood on the bridge of the U.S. Valkyrie, looking out over the expanse of space. The starfield before her seemed endless, and for a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on the hard-won victory. The destruction of the Empire's flagship was just the beginning, but it had shattered their sense of invulnerability. The Emperor, once a shadow looming over the galaxy, was now exposed, vulnerable, and on the run. "We've dealt a serious blow," Hunter said, her voice steady, though the weariness of battle was evident in her eyes. "But we all know they won't go down easily. The Empire has vast resources, and their leadership is ruthless. They'll regroup, rebuild, and they'll come for us." Commander Harris, standing beside her, nodded. "The galaxy won't give up. Not now." Not after all we fought for. But we need to strike before they can recover. We can't let them regroup and consolidate their power. Hunter clenched her fist, her resolve hardening. We'll strike again. We'll hit their heart, take their last bastion of power before they can rebuild. We end this now. As the Valkyrie and the rest of the remaining fleet readied themselves for the next phase, the galaxy was already bracing for what would come next. The Empire, though weakened, still commanded the loyalty of a vast portion of the galaxy's forces. Many Imperial fleets were scattered, but still capable of striking hard at the heart of the resistance. Every move would need to be calculated. They could not afford to make another mistake. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Emperor Joreth, the leader of the Empire, sat within his private chambers aboard the Imperial command ship, his mind racing. His fleet had been devastated, his flagship destroyed, and the galaxy's resistance had proven more formidable than he had ever anticipated. But he was not one to show weakness. The Empire's strength was in its unwavering control, and he would not let that falter. The rebels have had their moment of glory, Joreth muttered, his voice low, filled with venom. But it will be short-lived. The galaxy belongs to us. We will reassert our dominance. His generals, loyal and feared, gathered around him, awaiting his orders. They knew their emperor's wrath would be swift and unforgiving. "What is your command, Emperor?" General Korath asked, his voice cold and steely. "We shall not retreat," Joreth declared, slamming his fist on the armrest. "We will rebuild. We will gather our strength and strike them down with everything we have. The rebellion is weak, fragile. They lack the discipline and resources we possess. They are no match for us." While the Emperor plotted his vengeance, the resistance was already moving forward. Admiral Hunter, now backed by more allies than ever, was preparing to strike at the very heart of the Empire. They had tracked down the last of the Empire's strongholds, a hidden, heavily fortified world where Joreth had taken refuge after his flagship's destruction. It was there that the final confrontation would take place. The final assault would not be easy. The resistance forces had already suffered so much, and the Empire's remaining fleets were gathering around their last fortress. But they were no longer fighting alone. The galaxy had seen what unity could accomplish. Old rivalries and ancient feuds had been put aside in favor of a common cause. From the distant edges of the galaxy, new ships and soldiers arrived to join the fight. For the first time, the different factions that had once been scattered across the stars fought as one. The Excelcorians, with their advanced weaponry and ingenuity, had reinforced the fleets. The Rillians, using their psychic abilities, had pinpointed the Empire's weaknesses, feeding crucial intelligence to the front lines. The Terrans, with their unmatched determination and courage, led the charge. As the final battle neared, all eyes were on the Empire's fortress world. The Resistance knew it would be the most difficult battle they had faced. Every ship, every soldier, and every psychic mind would be needed for this final push. It was a fight for the future of the galaxy, and they would not lose. On the eve of the final battle, Admiral Hunter addressed the fleet one last time. "This is it," she said, her voice unwavering. "We've fought through darkness, and we've come together to face the greatest threat the galaxy has ever known. Today, we finish what we started. For every life lost, for every world torn apart, we fight. We fight for the future of our children, for the freedom of every species. We fight, not because we have to, but because we choose to." The fleet surged forward, their hearts filled with determination, their eyes fixed on the prize. This would be the moment that decided the fate of the galaxy. The Empire's last stand was imminent, and the forces of resistance were ready. The final battle for the galaxy had begun. It would be a fight to the death, and one way or another, it would determine whether the Empire's shadow would fall forever, or whether the galaxy would finally rise from its ashes to embrace a new era of freedom. The fall of the Empire. The final battle was upon them. The galaxy had come together like never before, united in purpose and driven by the fire of rebellion. The Empire, though wounded and broken, still held its ground with unmatched brutality and determination. But the Resistance had learned from their past mistakes, and this time, they were ready for the fight of their lives. The fleet of the United Forces, Terrans, Selkorians, Rillians, and smaller resistance groups, had gathered just beyond the Empire's fortress world. It was a heavily fortified planet, surrounded by a deadly array of defensive systems. Imperial warships, their numbers dwindling but still powerful, formed a defensive perimeter around the planet. It would be a brutal and bloody battle, one that would decide the fate of the galaxy. Admiral Sarah Hunter stood on the bridge of the U.S. Valkyrie, her eyes scanning the viewports. The fleet was positioned, ready to engage, but there was a weight in the air, the kind that came with knowing this might be the last time they would see the stars alive. It wasn't just the stakes that were high, it was the sheer sense of unity among the resistance forces. Each ship, each soldier, and each fighter carried the hopes of countless worlds on their shoulders. Hunter turned to her crew, her face grim but resolute. "This is our moment. We take down their fortress, and we end this war. For all those we've lost, for all those who believe in freedom, we win this battle. No retreat, no surrender." The crew nodded, each of them understanding the gravity of the task ahead. They had come so far, fighting against impossible odds, growing stronger with every victory. And now they stood at the precipice of their final strike. The signal was given, and the fleet surged forward, breaking the silence of space with the roar of engines and the hum of weaponry. The Empire's fleet met them head-on, their massive warships looming like shadows in the void. Energy blasts and missiles lit up the dark expanse, each side pushing forward with all the fury they had left. The first wave of the resistance forces was led by the Terran fleet, their fighters darting through the deadly firestorm as they targeted the Empire's defenses. The Excelsior ships followed closely, their newly adapted weaponry piercing through the Empire's shields and tearing into their hulls. The Rillians, working in perfect synchrony, used their psychic abilities to disorient and confuse the Empire's commanders, causing disarray within their ranks. For hours, the battle raged on. The Allied fleet, though smaller in number, fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. The Empire's forces, though vast and imposing, were faltering. Their once impregnable defenses were crumbling, their ships beginning to fall one by one.